So we are live. I am here today with my new friend, Shoran Fracis, who has published an amazing book called Go Home, and it chronicles the experiences of an immigrant. And so as we have a huge discussion in our country right now, and I'll certainly get to some of the various points that I've heard recently, it becomes very important that we listen to those people who are affected by it, those people that have come into our nation in a variety of different ways, understand their experiences, their challenges, the questions and ideas that they may have. I am absolutely confident that in a nation this large, that is this rich, and I don't mean rich just financially, I mean in resources, I mean in diversity, I mean in creative thinking, I mean in education. We have so much here that I have to believe this is a solvable issue. I just think it's going to take more information rather than a simplistic solution. And so that's what we want to start talking about today.
Fully agree with you,
Double check my phone, make sure we're getting a good feed, and it looks good.
Right.
We can go
Let's
forward.
go.
Yes. So Sohrab, I want to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself and what it is that your message is and what kind of the punchline of what you want people to hear.
Okay, let me take a stab at that. Starting with who I am, nothing great. I write. I try to write fiction, literary fiction, and I have a couple of books out, and both are, I think of them as international books. My first was a collection of stories that went back and forth between a story in India and the same protagonist or central character transplanted in America. And so the subtitle was Stories of India and America. So already it was inclusive. And if anything, my message is always inclusive rather than exclusive. And it's international more than it is regional or local or even national. Because I don't think there's any dichotomy, any paradox between thinking. They're not mutually exclusive. You can think local, you can think regional, you can simultaneously think national, you can think international, and finally you can think global. You can do all of those. It's not an either or. So, and then the second book that I wrote is a novel, and so it's right from the title. I think it's geared toward. In a sense, the immigration issue is about what is home and where is home for whom. And so the title of my novel is Go Home. And that raises exactly that question. Where is home for whom?
How do you define home?
Yeah, how do you define home? What is home? A lot of people say home is where the heart is. Yeah, so I mean, for me, India, where I come from, where I grew up, is still home. America, where I've lived more than half my life now, is also home. They're both home. There's no dichotomy there either. It's not an either or. When I think of a way to define myself in terms of a label, even though labels are simplistic, I think of myself as an Indian American. Just like you have African American, you have Indian American. And I think that's inclusive. In my case, and in my character, the central character in Go Home's case, it's a little more international and inclusive than that too, because my ancestry is like Viraf's, like my central characters, is ancient Persian, which is to say pre-Islamic Iranian. And so in an ancestral sense, Iran, especially ancient Iran, ancient Persia, is also home for me. So I can think, if I'm thinking nations, I can think of three countries that I can think of as home. If I'm thinking cities, I grew up in Bombay, the wonderful city of Bombay. in India. I've spent by now more of my life in Jacksonville, Florida, where I live, than in Bombay, where I grew up. So I think of Jacksonville, Florida as home too. So again, in my mind, it doesn't have to be very specifically just this. It can always spread out and include. And so my philosophy is always inclusive.
And I think a lot of people can relate to that, right? I mean, there are individuals who live in one state when they are younger, and they progress to many other states and locations, and they also consider those homes. So it sounds like, from your definition, it's more of a timeline, right? It's a trajectory of different places that you've lived and recognizes there. But what about, I'm going to play devil's advocate, those individuals who believe that by birth, having been here, that is the person who is entitled to call this home, and anyone else that comes here, whether that be legally, illegally, or is born here by someone else, is considered a visitor almost, right? It is potentially granted some choices or authorities, but not treated necessarily as this is their home. What is your response to that perception or belief system?
Very simple. I think both varieties are citizens of that country. I mean, I am a citizen, and you can argue that I went through a whole lot more to become a citizen of the USA than someone who was born here. I mean, so what did you do? You were born here, and you automatically became a citizen of the USA. In my case, I went through a long, long journey, not just physically or geographically, but again, chronologically, along a long, extended timeline of a lot of effort, a lot of risk. I put my life at risk, essentially, to change my life, to change my home. I had some conflicts, in fact, in putting behind my quote-unquote citizenship of India, because as I've said, I think globally. So there's no dichotomy in my acknowledging my motherland and my love for my motherland, just as I can acknowledge my love for the land I live in. I had to go through a lot, and I had to consciously make the decision, yes, I will. It is a good idea for me to apply for citizenship and then to become a citizen. Before that, I had even been sent a deportation order. Even though I had obtained a master's degree in engineering right here in the United States, and I had been hired by a top Fortune 5 company working for Ford Motor Company in Detroit, and the applications were in for me to get a work permit. People at INS, as it was called then, ICE today was INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Someone at INS, some bureaucrat who clearly didn't know very much about what goes into a master's degree in engineering, said, well, how come you're working as a program analyst or systems analyst at Ford Motor Company? I mean, why did they hire you as such? They mustn't have known what they were doing. And so we're going to deport you because your master's degree from the University of Delaware is in engineering, and here you are working as a program analyst at Ford Motor Company. Please leave. Please leave the USA within the next 3 weeks. You need to fly out of the country. And so even while I was working full-time at Ford, my head office, I was a consultant at Ford, my head office had to scramble, and I had to scramble all the more to file a legal appeal to let them know that, listen, here are what my professors at the University of Delaware are saying. Here are what my colleagues at Tata Burroughs, when I was working for a top Indian company, are saying they know my qualifications and they know, and here's my thesis in a computer simulation project. So what more do you want? Why do you think Ford hired me as a computer consultant if I didn't have the necessary qualifications over and above anyone else that they were looking for in that position? And that's when it went down to the wire. I mean, I did not unpack my bags. I had my bags packed. I had no furniture in Detroit where I'd moved to. I was ready to receive the final notice that said, sorry, your appeal has been denied, leave the country. And in a way, I was starting to look back towards going to India and starting up again over there. I'd done that before. And I love India. I always loved Bombay, especially South Bombay, where I grew up. And so I was living like that, literally going to work at Ford, working the full day, scrambling in the evenings and on the weekends to get affidavits from distant places like Lansing, Michigan, where one of my former colleagues at Tata Burroughs was working, writing to my professors and my thesis chairperson at the University of Delaware, all of whom very generously and kindly threw in their affidavits. And finally, at the last minute, the deportation order was overturned, and I was granted a work permit. So that's just to give our listeners an idea of what people go through in order to become a citizen of the United States. And there was still a longer road to go after that.
I think a lot of people would like to know what motivates you to go through all that versus get a job in India.
Absolutely. It's a good question because I did have a good job. I had a wonderful job in India. Now, I think, JJ, the answer to that question would have to be pretty individual and would vary from person to person. I can give you my answer. In my case, it was mostly circumstantial. When I first came to the States, I had finished my bachelor's at the top technical institute in the country, in India, and which is considered one of the top technological institutes in the world, the Indian Institute of Technology, that 60 Minutes has done features on, saying that this is one of the most difficult universities to get into because you have to write and rank high in a very stringent entrance exam. So I was all set in India, no problem. In fact, I was going to be the third generation civil engineer in my family, and I was going to join my father and my grandfather's company and just proceed to become a junior partner in very short order. So I would have done very well. And so the idea when I applied abroad for my master's for further education, and because of all my qualifications, I was offered a research assistantship at the University of Delaware to come over there and get my master's. At that time, in my head, I was getting further qualification that would help me when I came back and became a junior partner in my father's and my grandfather's company. And B, I was going to have a grand adventure of the kind that you are about to set out on this bus that you're conversing with us from. You're going to set out on your grand Ready Nation tour of 50 states. You're going to hit every single state, and I admire you for it. It takes a lot of gumption to do this. And so for me, at that point, it was just about the adventure of it. Let's go see the world. Let's go see America that we've heard so much about, that we've seen in the movies or on television, but never been in person, right? I'd never been out of India. And so ultimately, these things develop a kind of momentum of their own. And the momentum that got me to my master's and then into positions as a systems analyst, etc., it sort of, it snowballs. And once you've invested a lot in something, then you don't want to throw that investment away. So in my case, I didn't want to burn my bridges. I stayed in here. I battled for that deportation order. I survived it. Uh, I ultimately applied for citizenship and received it. And I'm proud and happy to say I'm both a citizen of the USA, and there's something that India calls an overseas citizen of India. It's an OCI thing, which is you're not really a citizen, but because you were in the past a citizen, you can now be what they call an overseas citizen of India, an OCI designation. So in
You're like
some
the
ways,
ambassador.
yes, because yeah, in some ways, any immigrant, any migrant even is an ambassador for where he came from, wherever he is now. So I think immigrants anywhere are very important and very good for the health of the country that they're in.
Yes,
So the
I think people
more
have.
my
Sure, and I would venture to say the majority of Americans would agree with your story, right? You worked hard, you brought some capability to the country that we didn't have here organically, or we didn't have enough of, right? I mean, we certainly have engineers and we certainly have computer scientists. We also know that we have a shortage of those as well. So that capability increasing is helpful.
Yeah.
How does someone like you who fought this hard to be a citizen through the legal means feel about those that cross the border illegally and
Yeah.
don't file that paperwork?
Yeah.
That seems to be the
The bone
biggest
of contention, right? Yeah, the big issue.
right. The
Well,
irony, of course, is that the individuals coming in illegally are not generally taking jobs that a lot of Americans want. And it is the ones more in your shoes that are taking jobs that are those higher end. But of course, I'm going to push back with exactly my earlier point is that we don't have enough people to fill those high end jobs. So businesses end up, and certainly you can check all the stats on it. This is not my impression. This is just data. We look at labor stats, and we have a shortage of individuals with your skill set. So we know that, but I think there is a skewed perception, right? These get intertwined and difficult for people to tease out. So what is your reaction hearing about individuals that come and recognize that you've not lived their lives, so you're not speaking for them, but more from the perspective of how is it to know how much you went through and see others not make those same, jump through those same hurdles?
yeah. No, I mean, that is the angle from which a lot of anti-immigration people come, and I think my answer would be, surely you recognize that they went through a lot too. I mean, they go through worse than I did. Um, they have greater obstacles than I did. And secondly, I I again, it's back to my global perspective. I tend to feel that, and I think it's a perspective that you get after you've lived in different countries for a while. That national boundaries and most boundaries are man-made. There's one thing about geographical boundaries that we're born into, but national and regional boundaries are more artificial than the natural boundaries. And ultimately, we are all human beings inhabiting the same globe, the same world. For me, especially when people talk about the southern southwestern border, uh, for me, come on. I mean, these people, we established that border through a violent war, right? The Mexican War, and there was a lot of bloodshed, and it impoverished them. And even since those days, we've supplied arms to Honduras and this and that, and their life over there has been impoverished. Their opportunities over there have been diminished. In part, at least, we have played a part in that. And so now they are looking to make life better for their families. It's their families. You know, you're going on your bus tour with your family. You're a family person. You love your children. They love their children. The opportunities that they have for their children have been diminished, and in part by our nation. And so for us to then say, how dare you come into cross our border, which we established through war and bloodshed, to come and take jobs that we don't want anyway, it's a little bit hypocritical, I think.
So I think the pushback then comes into, where does it end? How if there's no boundaries, I often say it is the balance between humanity and reality, right? There are truly finite resources in many cases, and it becomes difficult to expand those, and people struggle to imagine that. One of the analogies I like to give to someone is, anyone who's had more than one child, you often think after the first one you couldn't possibly love another one as much as you love the first, and yet you find that it expands. And so I do think there are analogies that help us understand, but there's fear, right? I think in many ways there is fear, and there is a feeling of not having the choice. And I think for a lot of people it's, why should I work so hard if anyone can come in and simply take advantage? Why should it matter that I was born here or that my family has been here for multiple generations if anyone can come in? I'm not saying that I necessarily hold those beliefs. I'm simply, from another perspective, the questions come in. And I will say that through my travels internationally, and I had an amazing opportunity not only to travel as a tourist, but to travel in official capacity. And what that means is, as a U.S. delegate, you are representing your country. And certainly one of the things that I found very powerful was that I was not representing myself. I was not representing only people who agreed with me. I was representing a nation of extreme diversity. And that meant that as an ambassador, in the general term, not in the official term of a U.S. ambassador.
Nevertheless, you were a U.S. representative at NATO peace talks.
Yes.
That's big.
Yes. But I just want to make sure, because there are official titles as well. I was not a U.S. ambassador. But as an ambassador of our nation in the general sense, it became very important to me that I represented in a way that honored, which in sometimes can be difficult, honored the perspective from all our people, and something I don't think a lot of people get the opportunity to do or get challenged to do. But one of the things that struck me in watching the other nations present their country, because we got a lot of cultural training and experiences, the pride in the history, the pride in the innovations, the pride in the science, the pride in the wins, the things that they did together as a culture and a team, it was so pronounced. And our country is in an unusual situation. A, we're young, right, compared to many of the other countries. And B, we started as a nation people chose to come to, not as a nation that has thousands of years of people simply continuously having generations born here. And I think now what we've had is this friction point. Where we now have generations that have lived here and now see themselves as the cultural representation of an America and an American dream that they have in their mind, and people that continue to come to this nation as immigrants, which actually reflect the way we started. And the question is, which is right? Does either have to be right, or can we find a harmonious solution? So this will be our last question, but I want to pass it to you because you have an outside perspective, and like me, have seen from other countries other examples and other ways of doing things. How do we spread those resources and ensure that we can have both kinds of Americans, those that have been here for generations and those that are new?
Yeah. So, I mean, to start with, I would point out, as you said, Immigration has been what has fueled the success of America. And so we're not taking away, we're not draining the resources, we're contributing, we're adding to the resources. Studies will show and have shown that we boost the economy. We pour more into, if you're thinking about taxes, we pay taxes like anyone else. We pay more into Social Security than we get out. So first of all, that's a moot issue. I mean, we are benefiting this country. Uh, Secondly, it's understandable that there's a human response um, to hold on, to protect, to safeguard what is seen as a territorial thing. You know, territorialism is sort of innate in us, right? As we evolved, except as the human species has evolved, our territories have expanded too. Uh, and so where there is a protectionist kind of impulse, uh, I think there is also an inclusive impulse built into us. And the more we shrink the world, and the more all of us become part of one big society, one larger society. The larger society is a global society. And of course, the American society is a great society in and of itself. And of course, the Indian society is a great society in and of itself. Of course, the Chinese society is a great society in and of itself. But we all belong to the same global society. So once we start to see that our resources can go towards something even larger, then I think we can stop worrying. I think education, for instance, you know, if it plays a big part in all of this, because otherwise there's that fear that you talked about, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the dangerous other, right? That's what xenophobia is, the fear of the dangerous other, fear of the unknown. And the more you shrink the world, and the more we and maybe exchange students, you know, I've always said, you know, a couple of years, if everyone had, instead of mandatory drafts, if everyone had a mandatory 2-year higher studies in somewhere abroad, and on exchange, someone came from there to their country, then eventually we would all start to think of ourselves as belonging to that same global society. And education would make that society better. So widespread education, I think, is really, really important for this.
Yes, we call it education for humanity. And it was something we were working on. Yeah, we were working on it on the inside under DOD. So I'll end with this, kind of summarizing some of your points.
Not before we point out that, as you just mentioned, you were director of innovations. So you have an innovative mindset. You were director of innovations at the DOD. So now carry on.
Yes,
and an honor. Let me just
full title, right? It's Director of Innovation for the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative under the Office of the Secretary of Defense and Personnel and Readiness for Force Education and Training. That is the full title.
Awesome. It's an awesome title.
Absolute accurate wickets. But I will say something that we talked a lot about in defense, and I think it's right to your point, is that what I found, and I know our boots on the ground, our military men and women that are in theater, they know they have to work as a team, and that it's beneficial to have different people with different skill sets, because you're able, especially under stress, to react better because you have a variety of skills available versus multiples of the same. We found the same discussions when we were talking at the strategic level at NATO and Partnership for Peace and other international organizations. And that was that some of these smaller nations have more agility. They could change their laws. They could try out new things in ways we as a large country could not do. Yeah. We had resources, capabilities, and access to diversity they didn't. And when we thought of ourselves instead of as one up, one down, winners, losers, who had more of which or the other, and instead reacted as teammates, global teammates, that's when we started to have discussions that made sense, because it wasn't just that it was a kind thing to recognize everyone's skill set. It was actually that it was a wise thing to do, to recognize and appreciate what everybody could bring to the table. I think if we can get to a point where we think of the world that way and recognize the capabilities of each group, we will let go of some of these fears. We will be able to connect in the ways that you've discussed. And I think you do it with education, you do it in the economy, and you do it with vision. And my last point will be, I look forward to you having huge book sales so that you can create the scholarship for all the children around the world to be traveling for their 2-year internships.
I look forward to you having a successful campaign.
Well, thank you. And this was wonderful. And I look forward to us continuing to connect. And we will be having more of these talks and different topics. But since we are doing this often virtually, we can always swing back and have questions. So certainly post them, send them. We can always add another segment. So thank you so much, Fred, for coming on today. This was fantastic. And thank you for teaching us.